The wheat should have been gold by now. That was the cruelest part of it. Not the rain, not the numbers, not even the certified letter from the bank that was still sitting on the kitchen table where Dorothy had left it after reading it twice and not touching it again. The cruelest part was that the wheat was beautiful. Standing in the field on the 1st of July, it had been exactly what 41 years of watching this land had taught her to expect, heavy-headed and copper-colored under the midsummer Kansas sun. The whole 3,200 acres of it swaying in the afternoon wind like a single organism, like something that knew its own worth and was unhurried about demonstrating it. Dorothy Hargrove was 68 years old, and she had never in her life taken a single acre of this farm for granted, not one. Dorothy had come to farming the way second-generation farmers often come to it, not by romantic choice, but by the slow accretion of competence and connection that happens when you spend your formative years on land that has its own demands and its own rewards, when you learn before you consciously decide to learn that the work is not separate from the person who performs it, but is in fact a primary method by which that person comes to understand themselves. By the time she was 30, she knew more about wheat than most agronomists she would meet in the decades to come. By the time she was 40, she had developed the specific sixth sense that experienced grain farmers carry, the ability to read a field the way others read a face to feel in the quality of the morning air and the specific shade of green in a stand of winter wheat, something about what that crop would produce and what it would need from the days and weeks ahead. She had never spoken about this gift in terms that might have sounded mystical because she was not a mystical person. She spoke about it in the practical language of accumulated observation, which was the language she used for everything important. The land itself had a character. This was not sentiment, but fact. The specific combination of Pratt County's sandy loam topsoil and its particular subcutaneous clay shelf, the way the prevailing southwest winds came across the farm at a consistent angle that had shaped the arrangement of windbreaks and the orientation of fields over generations, the specific quality of the water table, and the particular mineral balance of a soil that had been farmed by one family for 100 years, with the specific rotational practices and soil management choices that the Hargrove family had made. All of this produced a growing environment that was not generic, it was particular. And when you grew grain in a particular environment and you knew that environment the way Dorothy knew this one, you produced grain that was not generic either. This was the thing she had been trying to explain to herself on the drive back from the cooperative that August morning in the 6 minutes she sat in the parking lot before she started the truck. It was not just grain. It was this grain from this ground in this year, in this specific climatic circumstance. The rain that had ruined it for one purpose might have made it useful for another. The question was whether anyone was paying attention to the right thing. She had grown up the daughter of a neighboring farm family 2 counties over, married Walter Hargrove at 26, and moved on to this land the following spring as both a bride and an apprentice, learning the specific rhythms and requirements and the particular stubbornness of this section of Pratt County, Kansas, through the combination of hard work and patient observation that Walter had always insisted was the only real education available in agriculture. She had kept the books, selected the seed varieties, run the parts orders, managed the vendor relationships, and spent 4 decades watching Walter grow from a capable young farmer into the kind of man who understood his land the way a musician understands an instrument, not just technically, not just practically, but intuitively, by a kind of listening that was deeper than thought. They had raised 2 sons here, both of whom had moved on to lives elsewhere, lives built in cities and shaped by a calendar that had no relation to the seasons. She loved her sons the way parents love children who have chosen a different country, with a permanent accepting tenderness that required no proximity to remain entirely intact. But this farm had never felt emptier for their absence, because the farm itself was always full of work, full of decision, full of the particular presence that the land requires from the people who manage it. The stroke had come on a Tuesday in February. She had driven into Pratt that morning to pick up a hydraulic fitting for the grain cart and refill Walter's blood pressure prescription. The drive was 22 miles, and she had made it 10,000 times. She had stopped at the parts counter, stopped at the pharmacy, picked up a pound of coffee and 2 pork chops at the grocery store on Main, and driven home through the bare winter fields in the particular quiet of a cold Kansas morning, when the sky is the color of old pewter and the ground is frozen solid and the whole landscape seems to be waiting for something. When she came through the back door into the kitchen, Walter was on the floor. His right arm was pinned beneath him. His eyes were open. He was breathing. She had not screamed. She had set down the grocery bag with both hands in one deliberate motion and called 911. And while she waited, she had knelt beside him and held his left hand and talked to him in a low, steady voice. Not about anything in particular, just making sure that wherever he was in the dimness of those 19 minutes, he knew he was not alone. She talked about the hydraulic fitting. She talked about whether the pork chops needed to marinate. She talked about the forecast for the week, which was more cold, more gray, the slow, long wait for spring that February in Kansas demands each year clear with absolute authority. She talked about nothing and everything the way you talk when what you are really doing is keeping a thread of connection intact by sheer force of willingness. The EMTs had said 19 minutes was a very good response time for Pratt County. The neurosurgeon in Wichita had said 19 minutes was the difference between the outcome they had and outcomes that were considerably worse. Dorothy had nodded at both of these assessments and filed them alongside every other piece of medical information she had accumulated since February in the careful, organized way she filed everything, not because it helped exactly, but because order was a form of control, and control was what she had instead of certainty. Walter was in the guest room now. They called it the guest room. It was the room at the back of the farmhouse on the ground floor, the one with the window that faced the barn and the equipment lot and the long line of wheat fields beyond, and it had a hospital bed in it now, and a rolling cart with his medications, and a chair where Rosalind, the home health aide who came 5 days a week from a service in Pratt, sat and read while Walter slept or watched the view through the window with the particular quiet that had become his primary mode of engagement with the world since the stroke. He could speak, not fluently, not the way he had spoken before, that clear, measured, direct way of his that Dorothy had loved for 40 years. But he could say what he needed to say, and he could listen, and on the good days there was something in his eyes that she recognized as the man she had married, looking out at her through the altered architecture of his face with the same steadiness he had always carried. The medical bills that winter had been considerable. The rehabilitation in Wichita had been prolonged and not entirely covered by the insurance arrangement they maintained through the farm's business structure. Dorothy had made every payment on time without drama the way she made every payment, not because she was indifferent to the weight of those numbers, but because drama did not reduce them. By spring, the financial picture had the specific quality of a horizon that is still distant but is moving toward you at a speed you cannot fully dismiss. She went in to see Walter before she left for the grain cooperative on the morning of August 3rd. He was awake. It was early, not quite 6, and the eastern light was coming in low and flat through the window, laying a band of pale gold across the foot of the bed. Dorothy sat in the chair beside him and did not say anything immediately. She looked at his hands on the blanket. They were large hands, farmer's hands, mapped with the specific topography of 4 decades of physical work, the squared knuckles, the particular callus patterns, the weathering that comes from a working relationship with tools and soil and weather over the course of a life. She looked at them for a long time before she spoke. "I'm going to take the first load in today," she said, the cooperative, grain check. Walter looked at her with the patient-focused attention that was his post-stroke mode of engagement, the attention of a man for whom every act of communication requires a slightly greater expenditure of effort than it did before, and who has decided, apparently, that the effort is worth making. "I know," she said, answering a question he had not asked in words, but had asked nonetheless in the particular quality of his gaze, the slight tightening around his eyes that she had learned over the months to read with reasonable accuracy. "I know the moisture is elevated, but we are 3 weeks behind, and I cannot wait any longer." He said something. 2 words. His speech came out slowly now, with the patient deliberateness of a man choosing each word carefully because each one costs something. She leaned forward slightly. "Come back," he said. Dorothy put her hand over his. His hand was warm and heavy under hers, and she held it for a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the familiar weight and texture of it. The way she had held it on the way to the hospital in February and in the rehabilitation center in Wichita and on the front porch in April when it was finally warm enough to sit outside, and he had looked out at the fields with an expression that she could not entirely read, but that she understood had something to do with recognition, with the farm being still there, with the world continuing in a form that was still intelligible. "I'll come back," she said. "I always come back." She drove the Peterbilt herself. Hank Dutton had the grain cart loaded and the semi-trailer staged at the farm gate by 5:30, and when he saw Dorothy walking toward the cab with her thermos and her canvas jacket, he held out his hand for the keys in the wordless way that meant he was prepared to argue about who should be driving. He was 55, broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples in a way that had crept in gradually over the 23 years Dorothy had known him, and his expression at this particular moment combined genuine concern with the stoic resignation of a man who has made his case before and knows when he is making it again for the form of the thing rather than the outcome. Dorothy walked past his hand without stopping. Hank watched her climb the ladder to the cab, shook his head in a way that communicated his thoughts comprehensively without requiring words, and went to start the day's field work. He knew better than to push it on some things. The drive to the Midwest Grain Cooperative in Kingman took 32 minutes on Route 14, and Dorothy used those minutes the way she used most driving time, thinking. The operating loan from First Heartland Bank of Pratt was $178,400, principal and interest current through the end of July, due in full by September 30th. She had not missed a payment in the loan's 12-year history. Standard commodity wheat was trading at $5.72 a bushel on the Chicago Board of Trade. 80,000 bushels at $5.72 minus operating costs for the season, minus the combine repair in June, minus Rosalind's weekly fee, minus the carrying charges on the equipment line, left approximately $220,000 net. It was a number that closed the gap, serviced the debt with a margin allowed another year. The fields she had driven through told her that number was not the number she was going to arrive at today. She pulled the Peterbilt onto the scale pad of the Midwest Grain Cooperative at 9 minutes after 8 in the morning. Glenn Pruitt was at the scale house door before she had the engine off. That was a bad sign. Glenn Pruitt did not come out to meet trucks. Glenn Pruitt stood at his desk inside the scale house and waited for the weight ticket to print, and then reviewed it with the expression of a man who was conferring a favor on the agricultural community by accepting its grain at all. The fact that he was outside standing at the door watching her pull in meant he already knew something about this truck's contents that he had not learned from looking at it. The regional elevator network talked, farmers talked. The whole southern Kansas agricultural community was a communication system that predated cell phones by a century and was not substantially slowed by their arrival. And by the first week of August, it was well understood in every grain office from Pratt to Kingman that the late rains had done something damaging to the Hargrove winter wheat crop, and that the falling numbers on the affected fields were going to be problematic in ways that could not be resolved by a few additional days of favorable drying conditions. Glenn Pruitt had been waiting for her. He was a lean man of 60 or so with the particular dryness of Kansas skin that comes from decades of outdoor work in a climate that alternately freezes and burns the moisture from every surface it touches. He wore the cooperative's standard beige uniform shirt with his name on the chest pocket, and he walked to the trailer without speaking and drove the pneumatic probe in without ceremony. A long aluminum shaft plunged deep into the load, pulling back a column of sample grain through the suction tube. Dorothy climbed down from the cab and stood on the concrete apron. The morning air was already heavy with the thick, flat heat of an August Kansas day, the kind of heat that does not arrive gradually but is simply present from the moment you step outside, pressing down from a sky that is brilliantly blue and entirely merciless. She watched Glenn walk the sample into the testing room. She had stood on the other side of that glass window enough times over the decades to know what each test looked like, what each movement of the tester's hands signified in terms of the result they were heading toward. She watched him load the moisture tester. She watched him prepare the sample for the grinding mill, the falling number test, the critical Hagberg analysis that measured the activity level of the alpha amylase enzymes in the grain. A high falling number meant stable starch structure, good milling quality, commercially viable flour. A low falling number meant the enzymes had activated, the starches were breaking down, the structural integrity of the grain for commercial baking purposes was compromised beyond any commercially acceptable threshold. She watched Glenn look at the falling number reading. She watched what happened to his face. He walked out of the testing room carrying a handful of grain in his open palm, not a weight ticket. She knew what that meant before he reached her. "Dorothy," he said. "Glenn, I cannot take this load." Dorothy looked at the grain in his palm. She could see it now that he had named it, a barely perceptible split at the base of certain kernels, the microscopic evidence of germination that had initiated in the field before the harvest cut it off. Pre-harvest sprouting, the act of a grain plant doing precisely what grain plants are biologically designed to do, responding to moisture by beginning the germination sequence at exactly the wrong time. In a crop that was supposed to be weeks from that stage, the 11 days of late July rain had been enough. Not enough to drown the crop, enough to confuse it, enough to tell the seeds inside the mature heads that conditions for germination had arrived, and the seeds had believed it. "The moisture is elevated," Dorothy said, keeping her voice level by an act of will that she did not allow to show on her face. "I know that. You have the drying capacity here. You have conditioned wet loads for the Hargrove account for 15 years. Alexander before me and me after him. There is a relationship here that extends over a considerable amount of time." "It is not the moisture," Glenn said. He pushed the kernels around in his palm with his thumb, and the small motion had in it the quality of a man who would rather be doing almost anything else. "The starch enzymes activated in the field. The falling number is under 130. Commercial flour mills have a minimum threshold of 300. Below that, the grain produces flour that cannot hold a bread structure. It dissolves the gluten matrix, turns the dough into a sticky, unusable paste. No commercial baker can work with it. I cannot take it into this facility as food-grade grain. I do not have a market for it. I have 80,000 bushels to bring in, Glenn. This harvest is the operating loan collateral. The note comes due September 30th. Glenn Pruitt looked briefly genuinely uncomfortable. He was not a cruel man. He was an institutional man, which is something different and in some ways more difficult to navigate. A man defined entirely by the requirements and protocols of his role rather than by personal feeling, whose discomfort with delivering an outcome that will damage someone's life does not change his obligation to deliver it. Force majeure Dorothy, he said, an act of God provision in your delivery contract. Your crop insurance agent is your next call. You know as well as I do it will not cover the full operating debt, but it covers a portion. He paused. I can give you scrap feed pricing, approximately 50 cents on the dollar of commodity value, but you would have to haul it to the feedlot operation in Hutchinson yourself. 50 cents on the dollar. Dorothy's mind did the arithmetic before she consciously chose to perform it. 50 cents on the dollar applied to 80,000 bushels at current commodity prices produced a number that was less than half the operating loan principal. It was a number that meant equipment auctions scheduled on short notice and attended by neighbors who would know exactly what they were watching. It meant the farm being broken into parcels and sold off in the way that farms are sold when the selling is forced quickly at prices that reflect the urgency of the seller rather than the value of the land. It meant Walter in a care facility somewhere in Wichita in a room that faced a parking lot instead of the fields he had spent his life shaping. She looked at Glenn Pruitt for a long moment. She said, I will be in touch. She climbed back into the Peterbilt. She sat in the cooperative's parking lot for 6 minutes without turning the ignition key, looking at the windshield without seeing it, letting the full weight of the situation settle into its final, irrevocable shape inside her. She was not the kind of woman who required extended time to process information she had already suspected. She needed 6 minutes to make the transition from suspecting to knowing and to find the decision that was waiting for her on the other side of that transition. Then she started the truck and drove home. She bypassed the steel grain bins beside the machine shed. They were committed to the carryover corn from last season, held in inventory for a price movement on the Board of Trade that had been anticipated for 4 months and had not yet materialized. She drove past the equipment shed, past the graveyard of retired machinery that occupied the northwest corner of the farmstead, past the vegetable garden that Rosalind had been helping Walter tend in spirit, if not in the full physical sense this spring, driving the truck all the way to the back of the property, to the old barn. The Hargrove barn had been built in the autumn of 1943 when Walter's grandfather had organized a traditional barn raising with 10 neighboring farm families, the kind of communal labor event that had been the backbone of rural American agriculture for 2 centuries and was nearly extinct by the time Dorothy was born. The result was a timber frame structure of extraordinary scale, 112 feet along its ridgeline, 42 feet to the peak of its gambrel roof, assembled from white oak timbers that had been hand-hewn on site and joined without a single nail in the main structural frame using the mortise and tenon joinery that 18th century craftsmen had perfected and that, as it turned out, produced connections capable of enduring 80 years of Kansas weather with nothing more than periodic maintenance. The red paint had faded over the decades to a gray that was actually more beautiful than the original red in the way that weathered things acquire a color that painted things never quite achieve. The corrugated metal roof had been patched 3 times. There was a family of raccoons in the upper loft and a population of barn swallows in the gable vents and on the ground floor, approximately 3 decades worth of obsolete equipment that no one had gotten around to hauling to the salvage yard. She had loved the old barn in the specific way that a person loves a thing whose utility has never been in question, with the fond, practical affection of someone who has relied on a structure for decades and has come to regard its continuing presence as a natural feature of the landscape rather than an achievement of construction. Walter's grandfather had raised the barn in 10 days with 10 families, feeding everyone for the duration and paying the labor with the labor itself, an economy of mutual support that had been the native economy of rural America for as long as there had been farms in need of barns. The families that came were the Duttons and the Kriegers and the Marshalls, and 7 others whose descendant names were still present on mailboxes throughout the county. Some of them, though, the farms themselves had changed hands more than once. It was the last barn raising in Pratt County. There had not been another because by the time the next large barn was needed, the logic of the barn raising had been replaced by the logic of the contractor and the steel building supplier, and the specific social technology of the communal work party had gone into whatever archive holds the tools that people used to need and no longer do. The oak timbers that framed the interior had been selected from a stand of timber on the Hargrove property's northeast corner trees that were already old in 1943 and whose wood had the specific density and stability that comes from slow growth in a climate that does not coddle anything. Walter's grandfather had selected them personally, walking the timber stand in the spring of that year and marking the trees with a paint blaze, choosing for straight grain and clear heartwood in the manner of a person who understood that what you put in the structural members of a building would determine what that building could bear for the next century. He had been, by all accounts that survived in family memory, a man of exacting standards applied without drama, a quality Dorothy recognized in Walter and suspected she had cultivated in herself over the course of their marriage through simple proximity to it. The barn had stored everything over the decades: loose hay in the upper loft from the horse farming era, then bagged seed, then commodity grain in temporary bins, then the miscellaneous equipment and implements and parts that accumulate on working farms like sediment layers of previous agricultural eras, deposited and never fully cleared. Dorothy had not minded its gradual retirement from active use. The barn's ongoing presence on the property was itself a form of utility. It held the memory of the farm's history in a form that was physical rather than documentary, and physical memory is more durable than any other kind. Now she was asking it to hold something else. Hank Dutton walked out of the machine shed when the Peterbilt pulled up and parked beside the old barn. He looked at the truck. He looked at Dorothy's face as she climbed down from the cab. He had known Dorothy Hargrove for 23 years, and he read her face with the accuracy of long familiarity. "How bad?" he said. "It was not a question." "Rejected," Dorothy said. Hank absorbed this. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the old barn, doing the same arithmetic Dorothy had done in the parking lot. Then he looked back at Dorothy with the look of a man who has understood where this is going and is going to say his piece about it before he goes there. "Dorothy," he said slowly. "Get the skid steer," she said. "I need you to clear the equipment off the ground floor, everything, all of it. Sweep what you can and patch the worst of the roof leaks with whatever flat metal you have in the maintenance bay. We are going to unload the harvest here." Hank did not move immediately. He had organized specific opinions about this plan, and he was going to share them fully. "That grain is live," he said, "biologically active, moisture-stressed, and partially germinated. You pile 80,000 bushels of sprouted wheat in a timber structure with no hopper bottom, no aeration floor, no built-in ventilation system. It is going to generate heat from the inside out. The biological activity in partially germinated grain produces its own thermal energy. If the core temperature gets high enough and you get a localized hotspot, you get a grain fire. A grain fire in a wooden building constructed in 1943 means you lose the barn, you lose the grain, and if the wind is wrong, you lose the machine shed and possibly the equipment lot. And we will have a county fire marshal on us that same afternoon." "I know the risk," Dorothy said. "I am not sure you do," Hank said, and he said it carefully, not as a challenge, but as a statement of genuine concern from a man who has spent 23 years working for someone he respects and is saying something he feels morally obligated to say, even though he already knows it will not change the outcome. "Hank," Dorothy looked at him directly, "if I haul it to the feedlot in Hutchinson, they give me 50 cents on the dollar of commodity value. That number does not cover half of the operating loan. The bank takes the equipment first, then the land. Walter goes into a facility in Wichita, in a room with a window that faces a parking structure. 4 generations of this family end because I had a bad weather year and could not make a payment on time." She paused, and her voice when it continued was level and clear and entirely without self-pity, which was a quality Hank Dutton had come to recognize over 23 years as the specific frequency at which Dorothy Hargrove made her most irreversible decisions. "If the grain is in the barn, I still own it. I still have time to find another answer. If it fires off and I lose it, I am no worse off than I am right now. The net outcome is the same, but at least here I gave myself the chance to think." "Get the skid steer, Hank." Hank looked at her for a long moment, then he walked to the equipment shed and came back with the skid steer. The work that followed occupied the next 3 weeks in the way that truly difficult physical labor occupies time, not as something experienced in sequence, but as a continuous present, a state of being that has no yesterday and no tomorrow, and no awareness of anything other than the immediate task and the specific ache of the muscles performing it. Dorothy and Hank worked from before dawn until well after dark each day. They ran the John Deere through the fields on a schedule that the continuing August heat made relentless harvesting the delayed crop in the specific race against conditions that a late harvest always involves. They staged the semi-trailers at the field ends, loaded them from the grain cart, drove them to the barn, and unloaded them through the old Westfield auger they had rigged through the hayloft door. The wheat falling into the interior of the old barn in long, golden cascades that caught the light through the gaps in the siding and built from the dirt floor in dunes and ridges and shifting planes that climbed the interior walls and pressed against the first loft joists. The barn was not silent about what it thought of this arrangement. The old oak beams spoke, not in the sharp, alarming way of imminent structural failure, but in the slow, considered language of aged wood accepting an unfamiliar load, a series of creaks and long, groaning tones that ran through the frame from the foundation sills to the ridgeline each time a new truckload was added to the pile. Dorothy walked the exterior perimeter every morning, with a flashlight before starting the day's fieldwork, looking for new lean in the walls. Checking the sill plates for any unusual displacement, pressing her palm flat against the vertical siding boards to feel for any movement beyond the normal. The structure held. It held the way structures built by craftsmen who understood wood and load and the specific properties of mortise and tenon joinery hold, not rigidly, not without response, but with a deep and considered acceptance that communicated integrity rather than fragility. She bought 16 industrial box fans and ran extension cords through the barn's gaps and weatherboard seams, positioning them around the perimeter of the growing grain pile to keep air moving across its surface. Inside the barn in those first weeks, the dust was formidable, a constant fine suspension of grain particles and chaff, and the specific powdery residue of old timber that coated every surface and every person who spent time in the interior, requiring goggles and a respirator and the willingness to come out at the end of each session looking like something that had spent the afternoon inside a flour mill. The smell was something else entirely. Dorothy first noticed it at the end of the second week. She was inside the barn running the late evening check on the temperature probes. She had ordered 6 digital instruments with 4-foot stainless steel shafts and wireless transmitters when she caught it for the first time as a distinct and separate thing from the ambient grain and dust smell that was the barn's general atmosphere. It was underneath the familiar smell. It was warm and sweet in a way that was not quite any single thing she had reference for, not the sharp, acrid smell of mold, not the flat sourness of simple fermentation, not anything she associated with spoilage. It was more like the smell of bread that has just finished baking, or the smell of a cookie sheet when the butter on it has just reached the point of browning. It was the smell of sugars being made rather than sugars being consumed. It was a smell that was alive and purposeful, and she could not entirely account for this almost pleasant. Hank noticed it on a Thursday afternoon in the third week. He was repositioning fans on the south side of the pile when he stopped and looked up at the rafters with the expression of a man trying to identify something. "It smells like a brewing operation in here," he said. Dorothy said, "Keep moving the fans." By the first week of September, the harvest was complete. All 80,000 bushels were inside the old Hargrove barn, filling it from the dirt floor to a level approximately halfway up the interior walls. Dorothy stood at the barn door on a Sunday evening, the sunset behind her, laying a long orange light across the peaked roofline, and looked at what she had built. What she felt was not satisfaction and not hope and not confidence. It was simpler than any of those things. It was the feeling of a person who has refused the defeat that was available and is standing on the far side of that refusal, not knowing what comes next, but knowing at minimum that she has not yet surrendered the thing that was asked of her. The temperature probes changed the nature of the problem over the following weeks. September 8th, 96 degrees Fahrenheit at the deepest probe. September 12th, 103 degrees. September 16th, 109 degrees. September 20th, 112 degrees. The grain pile had its own internal geography. Dorothy had mapped it in the first 2 weeks through the combination of the probe readings and the physical exploration of walking its surface, sinking to the knee in the warm, loose kernels, pressing her palm into the face of the pile at different locations, and feeling the temperature gradient between the surface material, which was in contact with the moving air from the fans, and the material just inches below, which was in contact only with itself and the slow thermal convection of its own biology. The center of the pile ran hotter than the perimeter. The upper layers ran cooler than the lower. The southwest quadrant, the section farthest from the east side fan array, ran consistently 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the northeast quadrant. She had noted these patterns and adjusted the fan positions accordingly, running the east array at higher speed during the midday heat peak and reducing it at night when the ambient temperature dropped enough to provide some natural cooling through the barn's gaps. It was the kind of close, responsive management that no system could perform as well as a person on site, and this was the reason Dorothy had essentially moved into the barn for the duration. Not literally, she slept in the farmhouse in the same bed she had shared with Walter for 40 years, and she woke each time the temperature alert on her phone signaled a probe reading above threshold, which in the first week of September happened twice a night. But she spent the majority of each waking day in the barn's vicinity, and the barn had become the primary object of her attention in the way that a sick person becomes the primary object of a caregiver's attention, not out of anxiety exactly, but out of the recognition that this particular situation required sustained presence rather than periodic check-ins. She had also begun in those long days in and around the barn to notice things about the smell that she had not noticed in the first weeks of harvest. It was not a single smell. It was a progression of smells, or more precisely, a deepening of a smell that had always been present but was becoming more layered, more complex, more specifically itself as the weeks passed and the curing process, whatever it was called, whatever Whatever the chemistry underlying it turned out to be continued its work in the interior of the pile. The toasted honey quality that she had first identified at the end of the second week had been joined now by something darker and more resinous, something that had the quality of the old oak of the barn's walls and echo of the wood's volatile compounds that seemed to have migrated into the grain over the weeks of proximity and curing, the way a wine barrel contributes its character to the wine it holds. She had no name for this. She had no framework for understanding it. She only knew that the smell was not the smell of anything ruined, and that this fact seemed to her significant in ways she could not yet articulate. The critical threshold for irreversible protein denaturing in wheat grain was approximately 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The threshold above which spontaneous combustion became a serious operational risk was somewhere between 130 and 140 degrees, depending on moisture distribution and the presence of localized hotspots. Dorothy was managing a slow-motion crisis, tracking the distance between where she was and the line she could not cross, and that distance was now measurable in days rather than weeks. She and Hank spent hours each day turning the grain manually near the surface using flat-bladed aluminum shovels to excavate and flip the upper layers, exposing the hotter material below to the fan's airflow. The physical effort of this work shoveling grain that was itself warm in a barn interior that was stifling wearing goggles and a respirator that fogged over in the heat was the kind of effort that operates on the body at a level below conscious experience, simply consuming whatever reserve is available until there is none remaining and sleep becomes mandatory rather than chosen. The certified letter from First Heartland Bank had arrived on a Monday. Dorothy had recognized Stuart Langley's return address from the end of the driveway, and she had opened it standing in the gravel because she had not wanted to read it with Walter able to see her face from his window. The notice of default was precise and formal and completely clear. Outstanding principal and interest totaling $178,400, 60-day cure period initiated. Failure to cure within the designated period would result in the initiation of asset seizure proceedings pursuant to the terms of the security agreement. She put the letter in her jacket pocket and walked back to the barn. The local fire marshal came on a Wednesday. He was younger than she had expected, mid-30s, with the careful manner of a person who is in the earlier stages of managing a complex professional responsibility and is doing so conscientiously. He stood at the edge of the property and looked at the old barn with the expression of professional assessment that had in it no particular hostility, but a great deal of clear-eyed concern. He told Dorothy from a distance of about 30 feet that he was documenting the thermal management situation, that there were evident concerns with bulk grain storage in an uninsulated timber structure, and that he would need to see evidence of active temperature management protocols. Dorothy showed him the probe readings on her phone. He looked at them, wrote in his notebook, and said he would be back the following week. She knew that was not a threat. The threat was the other paper. Desperation, Dorothy had come to believe over 68 years of living, was not a single event. It was a condition that had stages like weather. There was the first cold front, which was alarming and demanded immediate response. There was the sustained low pressure that followed, which was simply something you lived inside for as long as it lasted, making your decisions under its weight. And then there was the stage she had reached on the night of September 22nd, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. with the laptop screen illuminating her face in the darkness of the farmhouse, which was the stage where desperation becomes a kind of clarity, where the absence of obvious options produces a willingness to look in places you would not have thought to look before the obvious options ran out. She had made the calls. She had called commercial millers in 4 states. She had called animal feed producers, 2 ethanol plants, the cattle feedlots in Hutchinson and in Liberal. None of them wanted pre-harvest sprouted wheat at a price that helped. It was grain that had fallen into the gap between categories, and the commercial market had no good place for things that fell into gaps. She typed the specific characteristics of the grain into the search bar. Not the failure metrics. She typed the other things, the things she had observed directly. Sprouted hard red winter wheat, high enzymatic activity, sweet aroma, warm temperature curing, natural heat barn, low falling number, distilling grain. She scrolled past the extension agency warnings, the insurance guidance, the vomitoxin advisories. All of these documents addressed the same thing, the rejection of this grain by every standard commercial channel. She was not looking for confirmation of the rejection. She had the rejection. She was looking for something on the other side of it. On the 3rd page of results, far down in a ranking that the search algorithm had clearly assigned low because the source was old, and from a subdomain that no longer updated frequently, she found a forum thread from a university food science department. The thread was several years old. Near the bottom, a user had posted a lengthy, opinionated, technically specific comment about the American craft whiskey industry. The user identified as P. Walsh Consulting Distiller, Denver, Colorado. The Post argued that the craft whiskey movement had arrived at its commercial moment without having differentiated itself at the foundational level, the grain. Small distilleries were sourcing the same industrially processed, commercially malted base grains as every major producer, and then wondering why their spirits lacked the layered complexity that defined whiskeys of exceptional character. The argument was that the most interesting flavor profiles in whiskey originated at the grain level in the biochemical events of malting, and that the most compelling malting was not the industrial version, controlled, consistent, predictable, and therefore ultimately flat, but the natural version, which was stress-driven and irregular, and therefore full of the specific character that comes from genuine biochemical individuality. He was looking for grain that had undergone pre-harvest sprouting in the field. He had a name for it, natural floor malting. He described the process in technical detail. The enzymatic cascade that normally occurred in controlled malting facilities was instead initiated in the grain plant itself by field moisture and early germination triggers, producing a biochemical profile that commercial maltsters had never successfully replicated. When this grain was subsequently subjected to the right temperature and atmospheric conditions, and here he was, specific, noting that the ambient humidity and volatile compounds of aged timber structures produced effects that no modern climate-controlled facility could reproduce. The result was a distilling ingredient of exceptional and fundamentally irreproducible character. He had left a consulting inquiry email address at the bottom of the post. Dorothy read the post twice. She read the relevant section a third time slowly. She looked at the clock. It was 17 minutes past 1 in the morning. She looked out the kitchen window toward the barn, where the small amber safety lights she had installed along the roofline were barely visible through the line of old cottonwoods. She thought about the smell inside that barn, the specific sweetness, the toasted honey warmth, the quality of it that was different from any grain smell she had encountered in 68 years of living on wheat farms. She searched the name, P. Walsh Consulting Distiller, Denver. She found a website for Walsh Agricultural and Distilling Sciences. The website was outdated but not defunct. There was a main inquiry number. There was a secondary line for specialty grain consultations. There was, on an archived speaker page from a grain chemistry seminar in Fort Collins, a cell phone number that Preston Walsh had apparently provided to conference attendees in a year that was not close to the present, but was still a cell phone number belonging to a specific person. Dorothy called the main number first, voicemail. She called the specialty grain line, voicemail. She found the cell phone number on the archived conference page and called that. She expected voicemail. She got voicemail. She said what she had to say without embellishment or apology. My name is Dorothy Hargrove. I am a farmer in Pratt County, Kansas on Route 281 south of Pratt. I have 80,000 bushels of naturally sprouted, hard red winter wheat that the commercial elevators rejected this season. The grain has been curing in a 1943 timber frame barn for approximately 3 weeks. The center temperature is at 112 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. The grain smells like toasted honey and warm bread. The cooperative offered me feed prices. If you are looking for naturally floor malted grain with genuine field character, I have 3 million pounds of it. Call me back. She ended the call. She sat at the table until the clock read 2:15. Then she turned off the laptop and went to check on Walter. He was asleep. His breathing was slow and steady, his large hands at rest on the blanket in the dim light from the hallway. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. The feeling she felt was not specifically peace and not specifically grief, but something that combined elements of both the feeling of a person who is simultaneously aware of the stakes of what she is doing and of the reason she is doing it, and who finds that the reason and the stakes together constitute something sustainable. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep much. The physical act of making that call at 2 in the morning, leaving a coherent, specific, professional-sounding voicemail on a stranger's cell phone in the hour when clarity is hardest to maintain, was one of the more difficult things Dorothy had done in a year of difficult things, not because the words were hard to find. The words had been ready before she dialed. What made it difficult was the knowledge of what the call represented, the exhaustion of the obvious options, the willingness to try something that she could not fully evaluate in advance, and that the professional in her, the woman who had managed a 3,000-acre operation through drought and flood and market collapse and personal crisis, would normally have dismissed as speculative. She was not a speculative person. She was a person who preferred solid ground under her feet and solid numbers on the page. The call was neither, but the solid numbers had already failed her. The ground she was standing on was the old barn floor, and it was anything but solid in the conventional sense. She was already in the speculative territory, whether she had chosen to be or not. And so the question was not whether to try something uncertain, but which uncertain thing to try. She had tried the certain things. They had produced the offer of 50 cents on the dollar and the advice to call the feedlot in Hutchinson. She was done with the certain things. The 3 days she waited for the return call were not idle days. She could not afford idle days. The temperature probes continued their twice daily readings. The fans continued their work. She and Hank continued the manual turning of the surface layer, which was progressively less effective as the deeper material's heat became the dominant factor rather than the surface material's exposure to ambient air. She wrote a complete financial analysis of every scenario she could identify, working through the numbers with the thoroughness she brought to every financial analysis she had ever done, and arrived at the same conclusion she had been arriving at for weeks. The current path led to one place, and the only way to a different place was through the kind of creative deviation from the current path that she had never been required to attempt at this scale before. On the second day of waiting, she drove into Pratt to buy feed and sat at the counter of the cattleman's diner for a cup of coffee before driving back. She did not usually stop there. She had stopped today because she needed the specific comfort of being somewhere ordinary, a lunch counter with coffee and a piece of pie, and people talking about weather and equipment prices and the relative merits of different seed varieties for the coming season. All the normal texture of an agricultural community going about its business. She sat for 40 minutes and drank 2 cups of coffee and said hello to 3 people she knew and answered their questions about Walter with the information she was comfortable sharing and the silence she maintained about everything else, and drove home feeling neither better nor worse, but at least temporarily reminded that there was a world outside the barn that was continuing on its ordinary axis. On the third day, the phone rang while she was in the barn checking the Northwest probe. She answered it before she had looked at the number, which was not her practice. She looked at the number as she was bringing the phone to her ear and saw a Denver area code and the number she had called from the conference archives. "Mrs. Hargrove," said the voice. On the afternoon of the third day, the temperature at the center probe read 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Hank came to find her in the late afternoon. He walked into the barn where she was standing with the probe in her hand and stood across the grain pile from her with his arms crossed. "Center is at 115, he said. "I measured it this morning and again at noon. It went up 2 degrees in 6 hours. At that rate, we are at 120 by the weekend. After 120, the protein chemistry starts to go irreversibly." "I know." "The feedlot would still take it as animal feed. 50 cents on the dollar is not enough to close the gap, but it is not zero. Hank, give me until tomorrow." Hank looked at the grain, he looked at the overhead beams, he looked at Dorothy with the expression of a man who has reached the point of having said what he needs to say, and is now prepared to wait for the outcome. "Until tomorrow," he said, and walked out. That evening, Dorothy was rechecking the Northwest probe when she heard a vehicle on the gravel access road. She walked to the barn door and looked out. It was not the white pickup of the fire marshal or the silver sedan of Stuart Langley. It was a black Chevrolet Suburban with Colorado plates clean from a long highway drive parked beside Walter's old F250 in the farm lot. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, solidly built with the particular physical presence of someone who has spent their professional life in environments that require physical engagement with the world. He wore dark canvas trousers and a button-front shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, and he was carrying a long stainless steel sampling probe. He looked at the property with the systematic, rapid assessment of a person accustomed to walking onto unfamiliar land and arriving quickly at relevant conclusions. His eyes found the old barn. Something shifted in his posture, a sharpening of focusing the specific quality of attention that precedes genuine interest. He walked toward Dorothy. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said. "Yes." "Preston Walsh." He held up the sampling probe. "I drove from Denver. 5 hours and 40 minutes. Show me what you have." Dorothy led him to the barn without speaking. When she hauled the door open on its old roller track, the smell came out in a wave, warm, dense-layered complex. Unmistakably the smell of something that has been undergoing an extended biological transformation rather than a simple physical process of storage. Dorothy had been living with the smell for 6 weeks and had developed a partial accommodation to it, but she watched Preston Walsh stop at the threshold of the barn door and understood that she was experiencing the smell from the outside for the first time through senses that were encountering it without any previous acclimation. He closed his eyes. He stood entirely still for 5 full seconds, breathing through his nose, and she watched his face. The professional reserve was there, the habitual skepticism of an expert who has been contacted by people with inflated assessments of their grain before. But the reserve was doing something in those 5 seconds that reserve does not usually do. It was thinning visibly in the presence of a sensory input that apparently exceeded what the reserve had been calibrated to handle. Then he walked into the barn. He climbed the grain pile in his trail boots without asking permission or waiting for guidance, plunging the sampling probe into the wheat at 3 different locations, pulling out the core samples and holding each one under the beam of a powerful compact flashlight. He rubbed kernels between his fingers with the practiced assessment of a professional who has examined grain in this manner many thousands of times. He pressed the kernels to his nose. He placed several in his mouth and chewed slowly, his gaze fixed at the far interior wall of the barn with the unfocused concentration of a person whose attention has entirely relocated to the activity of processing. The barn was quiet around them, except for the whir of the fans and the slow voice of the settling grain. Preston Walsh climbed down from the pile. He turned to face Dorothy. His expression had made a complete transition from the professional reserve she had seen at the barn door, and what had replaced it was the expression of a person who has found the thing they have been looking for in a place where they were not expecting to find it. The cooperative rejected this, he said. Every load I brought them. Told you it was ruined. Offered me feed prices. Said to haul it to the cattle feedlot in Hutchinson. Walsh made a short, sharp sound that was not quite a laugh. He looked out over the great expanse of grain in the dim interior and was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, what you have in this barn is not ruined grain. Through the specific combination of pre-harvest germination initiated by the late rains, the thermal curing environment of this particular wooden structure, and the ambient humidity and volatile organic compounds that 60-plus years of aged white oak introduce into any air that passes through these walls, you have naturally floor malted 80,000 bushels of hard red winter wheat. The enzymatic cascade that commercial malting facilities spend enormous resources and employ highly controlled industrial processes to artificially induce was initiated in your fields by weather and completed in this barn by accident. And the result is a grain profile with a biochemical complexity that no industrial process has ever exactly replicated, because no industrial process can access the specific variables that created it. Dorothy said, is that something someone will pay for? Walsh allowed himself a complete, unhurried smile. The premium craft distilling market has been looking for a reliable source of naturally processed specialty grain for the better part of a decade. What you have here represents the kind of ingredient that serious whiskey makers can achieve a genuinely exceptional and irreproducible spirit from. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and held it out to her. Letter of intent. $14 per bushel exclusive purchase rights to the full lot, classified as premium specialty grain for craft distilling application, contingent on the grain maintaining its current chemical profile and remaining free of environmental contamination until extraction. My transport fleet can be here in 14 days. Dorothy took the paper. She read it. $14 per bushel, 80,000 bushels, $1,120,000. She looked up at Walsh. He was looking at the roofline. She followed his gaze up to where the corrugated metal sheeting showed the evidence of the 3 most recent patch jobs. Through the barn's gaps in the siding, the evening sky to the southwest had acquired a color that Dorothy recognized from 68 years of watching Kansas weather move in from that direction, a deep bruised purple darkening rapidly, with a green undertone along the horizon that carries in it a specific quality of warning. Keep it dry, Walsh said. Keep it breathing. If that roof compromises and the pile gets soaked, the whole lot goes to mush before my trucks cross the state line. He pulled on his jacket and walked toward the door. 14 days, Mrs. Hargrove. I will send the full contract documents in the morning. She watched his Suburban navigate the access road and turn south onto Route 281. She stood at the barn door with the letter of intent in her hand, reading it in the last of the evening light, then reading it again. The paper was slightly warm from Walsh's shirt pocket. The fans turned behind her. The sweet layered smell of the curing grain rolled past her into the cooling evening air. The National Weather Service radio in the farmhouse utility room sounded its attention tone 45 minutes later. Severe weather bulletin. Derecho event. Anticipated arrival. Southwestern Kansas corridor approximately 11 p.m. Straight line winds forecast at 75 to 85 miles per hour. Flash flooding possible. Take shelter. Structural damage to outbuildings likely. Dorothy walked to the kitchen window and looked southwest. The sky above the Hargrove farm had taken on the exact color she had seen from the barn door, deepening, now moving with urgency. She went to the back door and called Hank. He appeared from the direction of the equipment shed, still carrying a grease gun he had apparently been using on the planter linkage. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of a man who does not run toward problems, but does not delay on the way to them either. Derecho, Dorothy said. 11 o'clock or thereabouts, winds to 85. Hank looked southwest. He did not need to look long. Silage tarps, he said. Everyone we have, staple guns, the heavy nylon ropes from the equipment shed, and the rolls of steel tie wire. Get the extension ladders out of the maintenance bay. We have 3 hours. She went inside, told Rosalind to take Walter's call button, stay in the interior hallway away from all windows, and not open any exterior door, regardless of what she heard. Rosalind, who was from Kansas and had been through enough of its weather to understand the instruction, precisely nodded and did not ask questions. Dorothy went upstairs, changed into the oldest work clothes she owned, came back down and walked out to the barn. Inside the old barn, the temperature differential between the warm grain mass and the cooler evening air had intensified. The existing convective circulation near the vaulted ceiling, Dorothy could feel it, a slow rotation of dust and warm air that was the barn's own microclimate asserting itself. But the air outside was beginning to move with a different quality now, a purposeful urgency that communicated itself through the barn's wall gaps as an intermittent pressure. Advance advance gusts that caused the old timber frame to shift in the particular way it shifted under lateral wind load. Not dramatically, not yet, but with a preliminary language of intention. Dorothy climbed to the hayloft. The loft floor was the original rough-cut pine planking of the 1943 construction, most of it still structurally sound, but with gaps where boards had been removed over the decades, and not replaced gaps through which the grain pile below was intermittently visible 40 feet down. She moved to the roofline and ran her palm along the underside of the corrugated metal panels with the specific attention of a person looking for information that the material will provide through the senses if you are willing to ask it correctly. She could feel the wind through the panels, a vibration and intermittent pressure, the panels lifting slightly against their fasteners on each advance gust in a way that communicated their enthusiasm for being released from those fasteners if given the additional motivation of an 80-mile-per-hour sustained wind. Hank appeared at the hayloft ladder with 2 heavy rolls of polyethylene silage tarp draped over his shoulders, a staple gun in his belt, and an expression that communicated his opinion of the enterprise without requiring elaboration. "The ridge is the critical point," Dorothy said. "We need tarps running from the peak down to the loft floor on both sides. If the metal lets go, the plastic is the secondary barrier. What gets past the plastic hits the perimeter of the pile instead of the center." Hank looked up at the roofline. He calculated risk in practical terms rather than abstract ones, and what he calculated took approximately 4 seconds. "Let's move," he said. They worked across the loft floor, Dorothy dragging the heavy polyethylene while Hank stapled the leading edge to the structural members at the roofline. The advance wind was strengthening, coming in harder bursts now, and the first rain hit the metal roof in a percussive pattern that was scattered and preliminary, but was not going to remain that way. At 9:40, the first real gust hit the barn. It was not the Dureco. The main event was still moving toward them from the southwest, but it was the Dureco's advance, a hard, sharp gust carrying the full weight of the pressure system behind it. The barn's response was comprehensive and immediate. Every board in the exterior walls flexed and resettled. Every rafter joint groaned its particular note. In the chord of the structure's response, the ridgeline shuddered along its full length. And a curtain of grain dust cascaded from the overhead rafters in a fine golden rain that coated everything below. Dorothy looked up. The ridge was moving. The corrugated metal panels along the upper 3 feet of the east-facing slope were lifting on each gust, rising against their fasteners with a persistence that spoke of fatigued metal and loosened screws and 80 years of thermal cycling that had worked the connections to the edge of their useful life. A second gust hit stronger than the first. The panels lifted higher. Through a gap that opened at the ridge for a half-second, Dorothy saw the night sky, a specific, violent purple-green, and then the rain found the gap and fell through it in a thin silver thread aimed directly at the center of the grain pile below. "Now," Dorothy said and went up. The main ridgeline was accessible from the hayloft only by climbing the internal structural members, the diagonal bracing timbers connecting the loft floor joists to the rafters, hand-hewn oak members 8 inches square that offered reliable footing under ordinary circumstances and substantially less reliable footing when the building was flexing in a strengthening wind event and the wood was beginning to pick up surface moisture from the rain. Hank secured a heavy nylon tow rope around Dorothy's waist and tied the other end to the nearest main truss post, an arrangement that was better than no rope and not adequate for what she was doing, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. She went up. The barn was speaking with increasing urgency, now the whole structure communicating the intensifying external load through the specific acoustic vocabulary of its timber frame construction, the deep resonant groan of the main trusses, the higher, more pointed note of the secondary members, the intermittent sharp crack that came from somewhere in the east wall and that Dorothy hoped was a planking board adjusting its position in its frame rather than anything structural. The Dureco hit at 10:17. She heard it before she felt it. A sound arrived from the southwest that was not the sound of wind as a familiar thing. It was the sound of an extraordinary quantity of air moving at extraordinary speed in a direction it had absolutely committed to. A sound with mass and intention that was entirely different from the qualitative experience of ordinary severe weather. The barn received the initial impact along its full south face, and the response was a sound Dorothy had no previous reference for, the simultaneous voice of every structural member in the building, bearing a load that exceeded its design parameters by a margin she was not in a position to calculate and did not want to. She held on. The ridge cap on the east slope peeled back in the second major gust. She saw it from approximately 12 feet below, a 6-foot section of corrugated metal, tearing free from its fasteners and curling backward with a mechanical finality. And through the opened gap, the night sky was briefly, violently present. And then the rain came through in a nearly horizontal column of water that hit Dorothy full in the face and shoulder and drove her back against the rafter she was clinging to. She recovered. She moved toward the gap. Working by headlamp and primarily by feel, the rain was coming through hard enough to compromise the headlamp's range significantly. She unrolled the polyethylene across the interior face of the open section and began stapling it to the surrounding timber. The rafter plate, the ridge board, the nearest purlin on either side of the opening. The tarp was heavy, fighting her in the wind that was now finding the opening and entering the barn interior with intent. Each staple required 2 hands, which meant each staple required releasing her grip on the structural member she was using as her anchor. She stapled, the wind hit, she caught the rafter. She stapled again. The rain came through the open section for approximately 4 minutes before the tarp was secured sufficiently to redirect the water. 4 minutes of rain falling directly onto the grain pile, 40 feet below. She told herself that 4 minutes was not enough to materially alter the grain's chemical profile. She told herself this and hoped it was true and kept stapling. At 11:40, the north slope let go. A section 8 feet wide peeled back under a sustained gust that she estimated later at close to the forecast maximum. Through this larger opening, the rain entered with considerably more force and volume than through the first breach. Dorothy moved to it. The barn swayed in the sustained wind with the deep whole-body flex of its timber frame construction, not racking, not the sharp vibration of modern platform framing, but a slow, profound movement that was simultaneously a demonstration of the structure's adaptability and a visceral reminder of the forces it was adapting to. Dorothy was above the grain pile, clinging to the structure's bones inside the barn's own response to the storm. And she did not find this experience calming, but she found it possible, which was all she required it to be. Her right shoulder caught the edge of a rafter when a sudden peak gust drove the building's lateral movement past the range she had compensated for. The impact was hard enough to be immediately felt as something beyond a bruise, a deep specific ache that she categorized as a significant strain rather than a structural injury, and set aside in the portion of her mind that processed events she would deal with later. She stapled the north section closed. She stayed in the upper structure for 3 hours and 14 minutes total. By the time the main body of the derecho had passed and the wind had diminished from sustained violence to intermittent strong gusts, Dorothy had stapled 7 separate tarp sections to various points in the upper framework of the old Hargrove barn, each one diverting water away from the grain pile's central mass to the perimeter where it ran down the interior walls to the dirt floor and drained through the gaps in the foundation. She descended the brace timbers at 1:30 in the morning. Her hands were blistered from the staple gun across both palms in matching patterns that would take 2 weeks to fully heal. Her right shoulder was producing a pain with a specific deep signature that confirmed the strain assessment. Her clothes were soaked through and coated in the paste that grain dust and rainwater produce when combined with sufficient thoroughness. She descended the final feet to the loft floor and found that her legs, upon receiving her full weight without a structural member to brace against, required a moment's negotiation before they committed to holding her upright. She descended the loft ladder to the barn floor and sat down at the base of the grain pile, her back against the warm wheat, and looked up at the patchwork of black plastic tarps crisscrossing the ceiling and the beam of her headlamp. Hank sat down beside her. His face was gray with dust and exhaustion, his jacket soaked through. He had been working the barn floor throughout, repositioning fans as the storm drove them off their positions, monitoring the probe readings, keeping the west wall's loosened planking from fully detaching by the mechanical persuasion of a hammer and whatever fasteners he had available. They sat in the diminishing noise of the passing storm. The water dripped from the tarp seams to the perimeter floor in a quiet, steady rhythm. The fans continued running. Outside, the wind was dropping from its peak into the intermittent gusting that typically followed a major convective system and would continue until before dawn. It held, Hank said, his voice hoarse from hours of competing with the wind. Dorothy pulled out her phone and checked the probes. The readings were down from the pre-storm peak. The influx of cooler outside air through the breached roof sections had done what the additional fans had not managed to accomplish, driving the center temperature down from 115 to 107. The grain pile had not gotten soaked. The center mass was intact. She was about to set the phone down when she noticed the lights. Not one set, many. Coming down the gravel access road from Route 281 single file, the lights low and amber and moving in the particular linked rhythm that someone who had once helped a specific man out of a ditch on this same road in a February dark would recognize immediately. She stood up. She walked to the barn door and hauled it open. The motorcycles filled the access road as far as she could see in the post-storm dark, their headlights a long chain of amber extending back toward the highway. They were pulling into the farm lot in careful single file, cutting their engines as they arrived, the quiet deepening with each engine cut in the way that a large number of people arriving in the same place produces a specific quality of gathered attentive silence. Clay Bridger cut his engine at the front of the formation and stepped off his bike in one smooth motion. He was a large man in all the ways that the word large applies: physical dimension, presence, the specific weight of a person around whom space arranges itself rather than the reverse. He wore a heavy canvas jacket over his vest, rain wet from the ride, and he looked at the barn and then at Dorothy standing in the barn door and then at the state of Dorothy, the soaked clothes, the blistered hands visible even in the farm lot lights, the shoulders she was holding, fractionally too still, and his expression made several transitions in quick succession before settling. He said a regular at the Cattleman's Diner in Pratt recognized your name from something you had said there once, and she had a number she had been told would get to me. She called at 9 o'clock. Dorothy looked at the lot behind him, at the motorcycles still arriving, at the men stepping off their bikes with the purposeful quiet of people who have committed to a task and are present to perform it. How many, she said. Clay looked back. 47. It was a Tuesday. Some of the boys had shifts they could not leave. 47 members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club standing in the farm lot of the Hargrove place on Route 281 south of Pratt in the aftermath of a Dureco, their bikes gleaming wetly in the amber farm lights waiting. Dorothy looked at them for a moment, then she looked at Clay Bridger. The section of Route 281 south of Pratt where the accident had occurred was a curve that most county residents drove without excessive caution because they had driven it 10,000 times and their bodies knew it the way the body knows a familiar road automatically, with the particular inattention that familiarity produces in humans and that had been responsible for many more accidents on that specific curve over the years than the road's design alone would have produced. Dorothy had driven it 10,000 times herself, and she drove it with exactly that inattention, which was why she was already around the curve before her lights found the bike in the ditch. What happened in the next 5 seconds was not reasoning. It was the outcome of a fundamental disposition, the specific operating principle by which Dorothy Hargrove had navigated every situation her life had placed in front of her. When something in front of you requires a response, respond. Not tomorrow, not when you have gathered more information, not when someone else has had the opportunity to go first, now with what you have. She had pulled onto the shoulder without consciously deciding to pull onto the shoulder. She had been out of the truck and over the guardrail and into the ditch in the conditions of 12 degrees and blowing snow within 45 seconds of seeing the bike moving with the specific urgency that is not panic, but is the accelerated version of competent action. She had assessed the situation the way she assessed every situation, quickly, practically, without time for feelings that would not help the immediate circumstance. Large man, not moving, lying in the snow, breathing, right shoulder and arm positioned wrong relative to the rest of him, skin color in the truck headlights, suggesting a core temperature problem developing in real time. Getting him into the F-250 had required the lever physics of her own body weight applied against the geometry of his. He was substantially larger than she was, and he was not in a condition to contribute to the project of relocating himself. She had managed it in 8 minutes, which was something she was afterward privately rather satisfied about, though she would not have described it in those terms to anyone. In the truck, she had talked to him without stopping because she had known from everything she had ever read about hypothermia that keeping a person engaged and responsive is one of the few things a layperson can do in those circumstances that actually makes a difference. She had talked about the farm and the drive into Hutchinson she had just completed and the hydraulic fitting Walter needed and the state of the winter wheat in the East Field and the price of crude oil relative to the fuel cost of the center pivot irrigation system and the quality of the coffee at the cardiology practice compared to the coffee at the hospital, and about absolutely nothing that had any urgency or consequence. A steady river of the ordinary world delivered in a voice designed to say, I am here, and the ordinary world is still accessible to you and you have not left it yet. He had been awake when they arrived at the emergency entrance, barely but awake. She had not known who he was until the hospital. She had not known his name until the waiting room. She had not known what the vest he was wearing signified until a nurse had said with a specific, carefully neutral expression that his associates had been notified and would be arriving shortly, and Dorothy had looked up from the magazine she was not reading, and through the glass of the waiting room door had seen 3 motorcycles pulling into the hospital lot. And she had understood then in a general way what she was dealing with, and it had not changed anything about why she had stopped or what she had done or whether she had the slightest regret about having done it. Clay Bridger had been an unusual patient in the specific way that large, physically confident men are unusual patients, deeply uncomfortable with the circumstances of needing care, tending toward understatement, about the severity of his condition, eager to move toward departure at the earliest possible moment. He had managed all of this with a dignity that Dorothy had found notable, because she had spent months in hospitals with Walter by this point, and she knew the difference between a person who is managing the vulnerability of illness well and a person who is merely performing the management of it. Clay Bridger was doing the actual thing rather than the performance, which was harder and rarer than it appeared. When he had asked her name and then asked what he could give her, she had understood the question as genuine rather than formulaic. He was a man who paid his debts and who felt clearly that a debt had been created here that he was responsible for settling. She had not agreed with this framing. The obligation she had felt on Route 281 had not been to him specifically, but to the general proposition that when something in front of you requires a response, you respond. You do not calculate first whether the response will produce a return. She had tried to explain this in the direct way she explained most things, and she had watched him process it with the expression she could not fully read. And she had thought afterward that the expression might have been the expression of a man recognizing in another person a moral disposition that matched his own in its structure, if not in its application, and that this recognition was both gratifying and slightly unusual for him. She still thought about that expression sometimes. She had been thinking about it on the night she left the voicemail for Walsh, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, with the phone in her hand and the decision about whether to call CB Dodge City still sitting unresolved beside the decision she had already made about calling Denver. She had decided that night that what she needed was a grain chemist, not a motorcycle club president. She had been right about that. What she had needed 4 weeks later in the middle of a derecho was something different entirely. The roof let go in 3 places, Dorothy said. The grain needs to stay dry and the air needs to keep moving through it. There are tarps and staple guns in the barn. The fans on the east side need repositioning, and the west wall has a planking section that needs to be properly secured. Claybridger nodded once. He turned to the men behind him and spoke in the economical way of a person who has said things once his whole life and has not found it necessary to develop a different practice. Within 3 minutes, the barn was full of people working. They worked without spectacle or theater. They worked the way people work when they understand the stakes of the job and have chosen to be present to it without reservation. One man with a gray-streaked beard and the specific physical intelligence of someone who knew structural assessment from experience was walking the interior perimeter with a high-powered flashlight, pressing his palm flat to each upright post and each sill plate with the same diagnostic touch Dorothy used every morning. He caught her eye and made a small, deliberate confirming gesture with his head. It was holding. Dorothy went inside and sat with Walter. She sat in the chair beside his bed in the dark and told him what had happened: the storm, the roof, the hours in the upper structure, and then the lights on the access road and the 47 people in the barn. Walter listened in the careful, complete way he listened now, and when she had finished, he said 2 words slowly and clearly. Good people, he said. She agreed with him. She sat with him until his breathing deepened back into sleep. Then she went back to the barn and worked alongside the Iron Wolves until 4 in the morning. Some of them slept against the barn wall in sleeping bags they had apparently brought in their saddlebags. Others sat in the farm lot in the dark, talking in the registers of men accustomed to late hours. Hank, who had expressed no verbal opinion whatsoever about the arrival of 47 motorcycle club members on the Hargrove property, had found the propane camp stove in the machine shed and had put on a sufficient quantity of coffee for a considerable number of people, which Dorothy understood as his own form of accommodation to the situation. Dawn came over the Kansas plains in the gradual, complete, and different way of prairie dawns, a slow brightening across the full eastern horizon until the light reached a tipping point and the world reorganized itself from the dark version to the daylit version with no clear moment of transition. Dorothy was at the barn door when she heard the first car on the access road, a silver sedan moving with the specific careful navigation of a vehicle whose driver was not accustomed to gravel roads and was paying deliberate attention to the storm debris, branches, sections of fence post, a piece of corrugated tin from somewhere to the south. It parked near the farmhouse. Stuart Langley stepped out in a tie, which told Dorothy everything about the intended nature of the visit. Behind him, a Pratt County Sheriff's Department vehicle parked, and a deputy got out and adjusted his hat and looked at the farm lot with an expression that was conducting a rapid recalibration of what it had expected to find. 47 members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club were distributed across the Hargrove farm lot in various configurations, sitting on the barn wall, standing near the equipment shed, crouching beside their bikes, attending to their machines, several of them drinking coffee from the stainless steel cups that had appeared from various saddlebag sources. Their collective presence was not aggressive. It was simply undeniable. 47 people in identical vests in a farm lot at 6:30 in the morning have a specific quality of presence that cannot be made smaller by ignoring it. Stuart Langley looked at the deputy looked at Stuart Langley. The deputy appeared to find something of interest on the far side of the lot. Dorothy walked toward Langley. "Stuart," she said. He cleared his throat. "Dorothy, the cure period under the notice of default expired at midnight. The bank has authorized me to begin the formal asset assessment process. I have the necessary court documentation." He held the envelope without quite extending it all the way, the instinct of a man presenting something he is suddenly less certain about. "I have something for you to read first," Dorothy said. She pulled the letter of intent from her jacket pocket. It was somewhat worn. She had carried it through the storm and the stapling and the long hours in the upper structure, but the text was entirely legible, every word and every number clear. She held it out to Langley. He took it with the trained attention of a man whose career is the examination of financial documents. He read it with the specific line-by-line focus that such documents receive from professionals who understand that the numbers are not decoration. His eyes reached the price point. He read it again. The envelope with this court documentation went back into his briefcase without being opened. $14 a bushel, he said in a voice just above the range of the ambient farm lot sounds. $14 a bushel, Dorothy confirmed, for specialty grain, classified as premium craft distilling ingredient. The difference between what you called this grain and what it actually is represents the difference between your offer this morning and the one I am holding. You are welcome to read the whole document. Langley read the whole document. He read the issuing party. He read the purchase terms. He read the contingency clauses. He folded it and held it back out to Dorothy, and his face had the quality of a man whose morning had developed in a direction for which no preparation was available. The deputy, Dorothy noticed, had found something very interesting to look at on the far side of the lot. The sound of a second vehicle on the access road turned everyone's attention. The black Chevrolet Suburban with Colorado plates navigated the storm debris and parked beside Langley's sedan. Preston Walsh stepped out with his leather document portfolio and a stainless steel thermos. He assessed the situation in the farm lot with the equanimity of a man who has seen most varieties of complicated early morning scenes in the course of his professional life. He walked directly to Dorothy. "Roof held," he said. "Roof held. I need to do a post-storm verification before I can confirm the contract." He looked at Langley, registered his institutional affiliation from his clothing and demeanor and the document envelope, and said, "You are welcome to stay for the assessment." Walsh went into the barn. He worked methodically, pulling new samples from 7 positions across the grain pile, examining moisture levels, physical kernel condition, and the aromatic profile at each position with the same systematic attention he had brought to the original assessment. He was in the barn for 22 minutes. When he came out, he handed Dorothy the document portfolio. "Post-storm profile is consistent with the pre-storm assessment," he said. "The only acute moisture intrusion was along the north perimeter surface layer only. Center mass chemical integrity is intact. Signed today, and I will have the transport coordinator on the road tomorrow morning. 14 days to delivery." Dorothy opened the portfolio. She read it. It was the full purchase contract professionally drafted with the terms Walsh had outlined in the letter of intent translated into binding legal language. The price, the classification, the delivery schedule, the contingencies, the payment timeline. She signed it on the hood of Walsh's Suburban with his pen, and her signature was steady and clear. Walsh took the executed copy and shook her hand with a grip that was a statement as well as a courtesy. Then Dorothy turned to Stuart Langley. "You will have the full payment wired to the bank's designated account within 14 days of the grain's delivery confirmation, which will be no later than October 1st. The executed purchase agreement supersedes the current default notice as collateral documentation, which your legal department is welcome to confirm." She paused. "I would appreciate it if you took your vehicle off my property now, Stuart." Langley looked at the contract, he looked at the lot, he looked at Dorothy, he got in his silver sedan and left. The deputy, who had spent the last 15 minutes finding the middle distance genuinely compelling, touched the brim of his hat in Dorothy's direction, got in his vehicle, and followed Langley down the access road. Dorothy stood in the morning light with the executed contract in her hands. Clay Bridger appeared at her shoulder. He stood there without speaking for a moment, looking at the access road, and then at the barn, and then at the letter. "Debt paid," he said. Dorothy looked at the contract. She thought about 14 months ago, the frozen highway, the man in the snow, the 5 seconds it had taken to decide to stop. "By you," she said. "No, you did not owe me anything when you came here last night. I stopped because of who I am. You came because of who you are. We are even because we are the same." Clay Bridger looked at her for a moment with the expression she had not entirely deciphered in the hospital and had been thinking about on and off ever since, something between recognition and respect, and something else she did not have a precise name for. He made no particular reply. He was a man who understood that some things are not statements requiring responses, but are simply the accurate shape of a situation. "We will be on the road before noon," he said. "Call if anything else comes up." "I will," Dorothy said, and she meant it. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club began preparing to leave the specific quiet sounds of 47 people gathering their gear and checking their machines before departure, the intermittent rumble of engines starting. By 11:30, the farm lot was cleared. The last bike in the formation was Clay Bridger's, and he paused at the farm gate before turning onto Route 281 and gave Dorothy a single nod that contained everything that did not need to be said. Then they were gone down the highway, the sound of the engines diminishing in the long, flat Kansas morning until there was nothing left of them but the clear October light on the road and the knowledge of what had happened the night before. The 14 days that followed Walsh's departure were a particular kind of time, not empty, not slow, but densely occupied with the sustained vigilance of a person managing a situation whose value was established and whose vulnerability was real. Dorothy was in the barn by 5:30 every morning, checking the temperature probes, walking the perimeter, listening to the barn the way she had learned to listen to it over the past 6 weeks, not for anything specific, but for the quality of its silence, for the particular sound it made when everything was in equilibrium. The grain was holding at 107 degrees stable. The post-storm ventilation from the roof breaches had settled the temperature into a range that was safely below the protein denaturing threshold. The sweet toasted honey smell had, if anything, deepened since the storm. Walsh had told her this was consistent with the advanced stage of the natural malting process, the enzymatic activity progressing through its full cycle, the complex sugars developing their final layered character. She spent the waiting days doing what was actionable. She filed the weather damage insurance claim for the barn roof repairs. She updated the farm's financial records with the executed purchase agreement, organizing the documentation in the way that a final payment into a bank account required, clean, clear, verifiable from any angle. She called Walsh's assistant every other morning for a transport update, not because she doubted the timeline, but because remaining in direct contact with the process was how she maintained her sense of agency over it. She sat with Walter every evening and told him in detail what was happening. Not in summary, not in the abbreviated protective version of events that people sometimes offer to those who have been through health crises. Walter had always wanted the specifics. His mind working through the altered medium of the stroke's effects was still Walter's mind, still capable of the systematic practical analysis that 40 years of farming had built, still interested in the details that revealed the actual shape of a situation rather than its simplified outline. She told him about the temperature probes and the fan positions. She told him about the post-storm assessment and Walsh's methodology. She described the grain pile as it had looked that morning, under the headlamp, the color of the kernels, the texture of the surface, the way the light caught the small variations in the pile's topography. Walter listened with his characteristic complete attention. On the fifth evening, he asked about the falling number, whether the process Walsh described would have affected it. She told him what Walsh had said, and Walter nodded slowly in a way that meant he was processing the information at the level where his lifelong agricultural knowledge lived, integrating it with what he had always known about grain chemistry from the practical side. On the ninth evening, he said Walsh's name correctly on the first attempt and asked if the man had the equipment capacity to extract 80,000 bushels from a barn with no hopper bottom. Dorothy told him about the industrial vacuum system Walsh had described, and Walter said ingenious, with the particular tone he reserved for solutions that combined simplicity and effectiveness in the ratio he considered most admirable. On the third day after the storm, a dark blue sedan arrived on the access road that Dorothy did not recognize. The man who stepped out was wearing a business suit of the kind that does not appear in Pratt County in any ordinary context, gray wool, well fitted with a lapel pin and a briefcase that had the specific weight of documents rather than personal effects. He introduced himself as a representative of Agricor Industries, a regional agricultural processing and grain handling conglomerate with interests across 9 states. He was pleasant and organized, and he delivered his position with the smoothness of a professional who makes unwelcome announcements as a regular component of his working life. The Hargrove farm had been a counterparty on a standard form grain delivery contract with Agricor's subsidiary, the Midwest Grain Cooperative, for 18 years. That contract contained a standard right of first refusal clause, which provided that Agricor retained the right to match any third-party purchase offer for grain produced on the Hargrove operation during the contract term. Agricor had become aware of the Walsh purchase agreement and was formally invoking that right. They were prepared to match the $14 per bushel price. He set the briefcase on the hood of his car and produced the document. Dorothy looked at the document. She looked at the man. She thought about Glenn Pruitt standing at the cooperative's scale house with her grain in his palm and the word rejected in his voice and the offer of feed prices. She thought about the specific sequence of events, formal presentation of grain to the cooperative, a formal examination, and a formal documented rejection. Not a negotiation, not a conditional acceptance, a categorical refusal at the earliest possible point in any commercial relationship. Glenn Pruitt told me this grain had no commercial value, she said. He refused every load I brought. He documented the refusal on the date it occurred. That is accurate, the man said, but under the contract terms, the right of first refusal pertains to grain produced on the operation generally, and the language provides that your company categorically refused this grain, Dorothy said, in a formal transaction with documentation. The right of first refusal applies to goods that enter a commercial relationship. This grain never entered one. It was refused before any commercial relationship was established. There is no legal standing for a purchase right over goods you declined to purchase at the earliest opportunity. The man smiled with professional pleasantness. The interpretation of the contractual language is somewhat broader, and we have legal support for... I am going to call my attorney, Dorothy said. Please leave my property while that call is being made. He left his card and left the property. Dorothy went inside and called Walsh. She reached him on the second ring and described the situation in the direct sequential manner she used for everything. Walsh said stay on the phone, and she heard him exchanging brief words with someone on his end in the abbreviated way of a conversation that had been partially anticipated. He came back. His legal team had been monitoring the situation. The Agricor position had no legal foundation under Kansas commercial law. A documented rejection constituted a formal refusal of the goods. The right of first refusal clause applied only to goods that had entered the commercial relationship. Pruitt's rejection was documented and dated and constituted irrefutable evidence that no commercial relationship had been established. Walsh's attorney had already prepared the formal response and would file it within 24 hours. Dorothy should not sign anything, not engage further with Agricor's representative, and should give his attorney's number to anyone they sent. He gave her the number. Dorothy wrote it on the notepad by the kitchen phone. Then she called Clay Bridger. She explained the situation in the same way she had explained it to Walsh. Clay listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You want some presents down there, not for trouble, just for presents." "Not for confrontation," Dorothy confirmed. "The legal position is sound. Walsh's attorney is handling it. But presence might help the situation resolve at the pace it should resolve at, rather than the pace Agricor's attorney would prefer." "I will send some of the boys down tomorrow morning," Clay said. The next morning at 8:31, members of the Iron Wolves arrived on the Hargrove Access Road. They staged themselves at intervals along both sides of the gravel drive from Route 281 to the farm lot, parallel parked on the shoulders in the orderly fashion of people who have organized the use of space for effect before and know how to do it well. They brought folding chairs, thermoses, and paperback books. Several of them, during the course of the morning, had conversations with Hank, who appeared to have arrived at a working philosophical position regarding their repeated presence on the property. 3 vehicles that turned off Route 281 onto the Hargrove Access Road over the course of the day turned around before reaching the farm lot and went back to the highway. Dorothy did not ask who was in any of them. A television news crew from the Wichita CBS affiliate arrived on the second day. Dorothy had not called them. A neighbor had a reasonable sense of which one, a woman from the farm 2 miles north whose opinions on corporate agricultural consolidation were both well-developed and long-standing. The reporter was young and clearly understood what she was looking at: an elderly woman farmer, a major corporation, a disputed grain transaction, a line of motorcycle club members along the driveway. She had the specific alertness of a journalist who has found a story with visual elements and human stakes in a configuration that almost never appears in this combination. Dorothy spoke to her directly, looking at her rather than the camera, and said what was true. She had raised a difficult harvest under difficult personal circumstances. The commercial system had rejected what she produced. She had found an alternative market. A corporation that had declined to participate in the transaction was now attempting to claim a legal right to participate in it after the fact. The reporter asked about the Iron Wolves along the driveway. Dorothy said, "Those are my neighbors. They are here because they choose to be." The piece ran that evening and was picked up by the Kansas City station by the following morning. By the end of the second day, it had appeared on 2 national agricultural news platforms. By the end of the third day, it had generated enough social media engagement in rural and agricultural communities across the Midwest that someone in an Agricor public relations office was having a conversation about it that was not comfortable. Walsh's attorney filed the formal response to Agricor's right of first refusal claim on the 4th day. The argument was precisely what Walsh had outlined. The rejection was documented, dated, and constituted a formal refusal of the goods under Kansas Commercial Code. The right of first refusal clause applied only to goods that had entered the commercial relationship. These goods had been categorically refused. There was no legal basis for the claim. Agricor's attorney did not respond immediately. The Agricor representative called Dorothy twice. She gave him Walsh's attorney's number both times and ended the calls. On the 6th day, Walsh's attorney called Dorothy to say that Agricor had withdrawn the claim. No statement accompanied the withdrawal, no acknowledgement of the legal position's weakness, simply a document indicating that they were no longer pursuing the right of first refusal argument. Dorothy read it at the kitchen table and added it to the file she had assembled, which now had the satisfying thickness of a complete record. She sat at the kitchen table with the document for a few minutes after Walsh's attorney hung up. It was a single page, formal letterhead, 3 short paragraphs of legal language leading to a sentence that said in the stripped, precise vocabulary of corporate communication that the claim was being withdrawn without prejudice. Those 3 words, "without prejudice," meant that they reserved the right to revisit the position at a future date, which was the specific language of an institution that had lost a round and would not admit it while technically not closing the door. Dorothy understood the language and was not troubled by it. There was nothing to revisit. The rejection was documented and dated and was not going to become undocumented or undated, regardless of how many attorneys Agricor retained. She called Walsh to tell him it was done. He said, "Good, I expected it by today." She asked him if he had expected it to resolve this quickly. Walsh was quiet for a moment. They had a weak position and a public relations problem developing simultaneously, he said. The combination tends to accelerate institutional decision making. What they were trying to do was aggressive and probably not sanctioned at the highest levels. Someone in their legal department likely told them this the day they filed, and the news coverage shortened the timeline between that advice and the decision to follow it. Dorothy appreciated this analysis. It was the kind of explanation that did not require her to feel anything particular about the outcome beyond the practical satisfaction of a problem resolved at the appropriate pace. After she hung up, she went outside and stood at the edge of the lot. The 31 Iron Wolves were in the late stages of their own departure, folding chairs being strapped to luggage racks, thermoses stowed in saddlebags, the specific reverse logistics of people who arrived, prepared, and are leaving with what they came with. She watched them prepare without approaching, and several of them caught her eye across the distance of the lot and gave the small nod that communicates acknowledgement without requiring the elaboration of words. She had not known these men 6 days ago. She did not know most of them now. She knew their president, and she knew what he was, and she knew the disposition that had produced the decision to send 31 of his members to sit along a driveway with folding chairs and thermoses for 6 days on behalf of a 68-year-old wheat farmer they had never met. The decision had not been about her. It had been about something that Clay Bridger believed about how the world should work when the large institutional structures in it behave in ways that the people inside those structures know to be wrong. She understood this because she believed the same thing. She had believed it on the shoulder of Route 281 in February 14 months ago in 12 degrees and blowing snow without deliberation and without expectation of return. The last bike turned onto Route 281 and was gone. The 31 Iron Wolves departed the Hargrove Access Road that afternoon in single file, heading back toward Dodge City in the long October light, the sound of their engines carrying clearly in the flat Kansas air for a long time after the last bike had turned onto Route 281. Langley called on the 9th day. He said the bank was extending the cure period by 30 additional days in light of the pending transaction, which the bank's legal review had confirmed as valid and collectible. His voice had the quality of a man making a practical adjustment to an altered situation and choosing not to elaborate on the circumstances that had produced the alteration. Dorothy thanked him, and her thanks were genuine because she believed in gratitude for functional outcomes as a practice that cost nothing and produced something. The 3 days between Langley's call and the 12th day were the last ordinary days Dorothy would spend on the Hargrove farm before everything about the farm's nature changed. She understood this as it was happening not with drama, but with the specific attentiveness of a person who has enough experience to recognize transitions when they are occurring rather than only in retrospect. The farm was about to become something different from what it had been, not different in the ways that mattered most: the land, the relationship to it, the daily physical engagement with its requirements, but different in the structures around that relationship. The economic identity of the operation, the way the wider agricultural world would understand what happened here and what it meant. She used those 3 days to do the work that she had not been able to do for 2 months while the grain crisis and the derecho and the legal challenge had consumed the foreground of her attention. She walked every field, the east fields and the west fields and the long, oddly shaped north parcels that ran along the county road, the ones that had always been difficult to plant efficiently because of the angle of the property line relative to the row direction, the ones that Walter had talked about replanting to perennial grass before the stroke intervened. She walked them in the October morning light and the October afternoon quiet, and she thought about what they would grow next season and the season after that and the season after that in the framework of a farm that was no longer going to be growing commodity wheat for the standard channels. Heritage varieties, that was the phrase that Walsh had used and that the Kansas State agronomist had used when Dorothy had spent an afternoon on the phone with 2 of them in the days after Walsh's letter of intent. Heritage varieties, the older wheat cultivars that the commodity system had set aside because they did not perform on the metrics that commodity production required, but that had flavor characteristics and enzymatic profiles that the specialty grain market valued exactly because they did not fit the commodity template. Turkey Red, Red Fife, Marcus. Varieties that the Hargrove Farm's specific combination of sandy loam soil and southwest wind and Pratt County groundwater might express in ways that the same varieties grown elsewhere would not. She thought about this in the east fields on the 11th day, walking the stubble rows in the low autumn light, and she thought about her great-great-grandparents-in-law breaking this sod for the first time, and about Walter's grandfather selecting timber trees in 1943 with the same exacting standards he would apply to everything else, and about Walter himself walking these same fields in the specific specific, unhurried attention of a man who understood that attention to land was itself a form of cultivation. She was the current expression of a long line of people who had paid close attention to this specific ground, and what she had found in the August of a disastrous year was that the ground had more in it than the standard measurement system was designed to detect. It had taken a crisis to force the question. She was not sorry about the crisis. It had produced an answer she needed. On the 12th day, Hank came to find her in the late afternoon with a specific quality of intent in his walk. "Come look at the East Field," he said. She walked out with him into the October afternoon. The East Field had been the last harvested, and its stubble was still standing in the particular gold brown of cut Kansas wheat in autumn dry and still in the calm afternoon air. Beyond the stubble, the field ran all the way to the tree line at the property's eastern boundary. And beyond the tree line, the sky was doing what Kansas autumn sky does in the late afternoon, organizing itself into a display of color that had nothing performative about it, no effort of beauty for its own sake, simply the western light on a clear October evening proceeding through its spectrum with the unconcerned thoroughness of a natural process. Dorothy stood in the stubble beside Hank. The Hargrove farm was 3,200 acres of this specific meeting of flat land, an enormous sky, this particular combination of soil and light and distance that the family had been cultivating its relationship with across 4 generations. Walter's great-grandfather had broken the sod here. Walter's grandfather had built the barn in 1943 with 10 families and their combined physical labor. Walter himself had spent 40 years learning this land through the continuous practical philosophy of farming, it refining his relationship with its specific requirements and its specific gifts through the patient, repetitive, never finished education that the land provides to those who attend to it. She was still here. The farm was still here. "It is a good farm," Hank said, not looking at her. "Yes," Dorothy said, "it is." On the 14th day, the trucks came. She heard them before she saw them. The progression of diesel engines on Route 281, the sequence of large vehicles slowing from highway speed to the careful pace of semi-trailers turning onto a gravel access road, the specific tonnage-weighted sound of the combination units navigating the farm lot. Dorothy was at the barn door when the first truck pulled in. It was a custom pneumatic bulk grain trailer, professionally maintained, bearing the High Plains Distilling Syndicate crest on the tank. Behind it came the second and the third and the fourth, and when the full formation was staged in the Hargrove farm lot, there were 9 trucks. Preston Walsh came in the 4th vehicle, a pickup this time. He walked to the barn with Dorothy while his operations crew began positioning the equipment. "Ready," he said. "Ready," Dorothy said. The extraction took 3 days. The equipment Walsh's crew had brought was unlike anything Dorothy had worked with in 4 decades of grain farming. Industrial pneumatic vacuum systems, each powered by its own dedicated diesel engine that moved grain through heavy-gauge steel pipes with a sound that was somewhere between a sustained wind and an industrial process, powerful and purposeful and continuous. The grain moved through the transparent sight glasses in the vacuum lines in a visible golden brown stream, and watching it flow, this grain that had been rejected by every standard commercial channel that had spent weeks in an aging barn under conditions no agronomist would have recommended, that had survived a Dureco and a corporate legal challenge, and the full weight of a farm's financial crisis produced in Dorothy an experience she could not maintain professional distance from. She watched the grain leave the old barn in its golden stream through the clear panels of the vacuum lines flowing toward the waiting tanks of the Distilling Syndicate's transport fleet, and she understood that she was watching the specific material evidence of a year's most consequential sequence of decisions moving on to its next transformation. It was wheat still. It would become something else. It would be milled and mashed and fermented and distilled and put into charred oak barrels in a warehouse in Denver, and the volatile compounds and enzymatic character and natural sugar profile that the Kansas fields and the old Kansas barn had given it would express themselves over years in the spirit in ways that no one could fully predict in advance. The grain was not gone, it was continuing. The 3 days of the extraction had a quality that Dorothy had not anticipated and could not have described in advance. She had expected them to be straightforwardly satisfying the problem resolved, the value realized, the outcome achieved, and they were all of those things, but they were also something more complicated, something she spent the 3 days quietly processing, alongside the practical activity of monitoring the transport operation, checking the vacuum hose connections, reviewing the extraction rate calculations with Walsh's operations coordinator. What she was processing was the end of the barn's role in this story. The barn had been many things. It had been an act of generosity, 10 families building something for one family in 10 days. In the autumn of 1943, the specific generosity of a community that understood its own interdependence. It had been a working structure for 40 years of agricultural use. A place where hay had been stored and horses had been sheltered and grain had been staged and equipment had been parked and children had played in the spaces between the stacked bales and the old wooden loft. It had been a monument to obsolescence for 20 years, after that holding the equipment that no one needed but no one was ready to discard, and then in one season of catastrophe and decision. It had been the vessel for the most improbable transformation Dorothy had ever been party to, the accidental conversion of rejected grain into something fine. The old barn had not known it was doing any of this. The oak beams that held the grain pile through the heat of September and the violence of October had not known they were holding anything more than what gravity placed against them. The volatile compounds from the aged wood that had migrated into the curing grain and contributed their character to the profile that Walsh had described as exceptional had not been offered intentionally. The barn had simply been itself, doing what it had always done, which was to stand in the place where it had been built and bear whatever was asked of it with the steady, undemonstrative competence of something well made. Dorothy found this in its way instructive. The grain was nearly gone by the afternoon of the second day. The pile diminished from its original fill line down toward the dirt floor in a gradual recession that felt to Dorothy like watching something that had been the center of her life for 3 months completing its intended journey. She stood at the barn door in the October afternoon and watched the vacuum lines pulsing with their golden brown cargo and thought about the night she had decided to bring the grain here instead of to the feedlot, the decision she had made in 6 minutes in a cooperative's parking lot on the basis of a calculation that had no guaranteed positive outcome and an available worse outcome that she had decided was already hers by default. You took the gamble that kept the possibility alive. That was what the 6 minutes had produced. Not a certainty of success, just the preservation of the possibility of something other than the defeat that was already laid out and waiting. She had been making that same gamble in various forms her entire life, she realized. Every year of farming was a version of it. Every season you put seed in the ground was a decision to accept all the ways that the outcome could be different from your intention, because the alternative was to put no seed in the ground, and that alternative was not available to a person who needed the harvest to live. You planted, you managed, you hoped, and sometimes what grew was not what you had planted, and sometimes that was the disaster it looked like, and sometimes rarely against the available evidence in defiance of the elevator manager and the loan officer and the fire marshal and the corporate attorney and every institutional structure that had a financial stake in the grain being worth what they had decided it was worth. Sometimes it was something better. She heard the last vacuum hose cut off its engine. The barn was quiet for the first time since August. She sat with Walter on the second afternoon of the extraction and tried to describe the sight glasses in the vacuum lines and the sound the grain made in the pipes. And Walter listened with his focused, careful attention, and at the end of her description, he said slowly and clearly the two words that summed up the entire season. "Well done," he said. On the afternoon of the third day, the last truck sealed its hatch. Glenn Pruitt had driven past on the highway twice during the extraction. She had seen his truck slowing on Route 281, the driver's window down, and she knew what he was seeing from the road: the premium transport fleet, the industrial equipment, the visible evidence of a valuation that was almost 3 times the commodity price he had named as the ceiling of possibility the morning he told her to haul her grain to the cattle feedlot. She did not go to the road. She had nothing to add to what the trucks were saying on her behalf, and they were saying it more effectively than anything she could have articulated. Preston Walsh found her at the empty barn door as the last truck completed its paperwork. The old barn behind her was vacant for the first time since August. It smelled of the grain that was no longer there, the ghost of the sweet toasted honey aroma embedded in the aged white oak of the walls and beams and loft flooring, absorbed into the wood over 3 months of curing in the way that significant events leave their residue in the materials that witness them. Walsh opened his portfolio and produced a certified bank draft. He held it out to her. Dorothy took it. $1,120,000 drawn on a Denver financial institution payable to Dorothy Jean Hargrove. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Walsh stood beside her without filling the silence, the way a person who understands the occasion stands beside someone else who needs a moment to occupy it fully. "What happens to it now?" she said. "We mill it," Walsh said. "We mash it, ferment it, distill it. We put it in charred white oak barrels in our aging warehouse, and we wait. Whiskey takes time. 2 years minimum, 3 or 4 for the profile we are looking for. Everything that is in those kernels right now, the complex sugars, the enzyme activity, the volatile compounds from the specific microclimate of this barn will express itself in the spirit over those years. What comes out will be something no one can reproduce because the conditions that made it no longer exist." He paused. "What you grew here by accident and kept by decision is the raw material for something that will last a long time." "By accident," Dorothy said. "By decision," Walsh said. "The weather was an accident. Everything after that was you." He shook her hand with the grip that was a statement as well as a courtesy. He got in his truck and drove down the access road toward Route 281. Dorothy stood at the empty barn door for a long time after the sound of his engine had faded. She drove to First Heartland Bank of Pratt on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the last truck had left. She parked in the lot with the deliberate care she brought to everything. She went through the front door with the certified bank draft and was greeted by the teller who had been behind the same counter for as long as Dorothy had been banking here. A woman who knew her the way people know each other in towns where the population is stable enough that you see the same faces for decades and the recognition goes deeper than names. Robert Alderman, the branch president, came out of his office and greeted her with the careful professional warmth of a man who had enough information about this visit to understand that it was not ordinary. Dorothy placed the bank draft on his desk. Robert Alderman looked at it. He turned it over. He looked at Dorothy. This will close the operating note, Dorothy said. I want to renegotiate the farm mortgage as a standalone instrument once the note is cleared on terms appropriate to the property's current position. I will need a summary of outstanding balances across all accounts before I leave today. Of course, Alderman said. He looked at the draft again and then at Dorothy, and he appeared to be making a calculation about what to say. Dorothy, I want to... Thank you, Robert, she said. That will be all I need today. She walked back to the truck and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes looking at the October sky above Pratt through the windshield. It was the specific blue of Kansas in mid-October, cool, immense clear, in the way that comes after summer has finally released the atmosphere and the air has been washed clean by a season of rain. She called Rosalind. She said, "It is done. Walter can come home." Rosalind said, "Oh, Mrs. Hargrove." The specific quality of those 3 words contained everything that did not need elaborating. Dorothy said, "Get the room ready, the real room, upstairs where it belongs." She sat in the truck in the bank parking lot for more than a few minutes. She sat there for close to half an hour. This was not her usual practice. Dorothy Hargrove did not generally require extended recovery time after completed transactions. She completed them and moved on to the next item on the list because there was always a next item on the list and because the satisfaction of completion was not something she had ever needed to linger over. Satisfaction was a thing that existed and was recognized and was then filed alongside the completion that produced it, and the list moved forward. But she sat in the truck for half an hour. She was thinking about what it would have felt like if the thing she had tried had not worked. She thought about this sometimes. She thought it was important to think about it, sometimes not out of morbidity, but out of fairness. Fairness to the version of herself that had been willing to risk everything on a decision that had no guarantee behind it. Fairness that acknowledged the full weight of what she had been carrying in the weeks between the cooperative's rejection and Walsh's arrival. The outcome had been what it was, but the risk had been real. The terror had been real. The nights lying awake, listening to the temperature alerts on her phone had been real, and the feeling of them had not been the feeling of a person who knew how things were going to turn out. It had been the feeling of a person who did not know and who was doing the work anyway. That feeling was worth remembering. She thought it was worth sitting with in the truck for half an hour in the bank parking lot on an October morning after placing a certified bank draft on a branch president's desk. Then she started the truck and drove home. The week that Walter came back to their bedroom, the one on the second floor with the window that faced east over the long fields, was the week Dorothy began the work of taking the old barn down. Not destroying it. She had thought carefully about the distinction. Destroying the old Hargrove barn would have been a waste of what was in it. What was in it was the specific physical intelligence of the men who built it in 1943, expressed in white oak timbers that had been selected, hauled hand-hewn, and assembled with the combination of craft knowledge and communal effort that built things differently from the way things are built now, the mortise and tenon joints. The hand-adzed faces of the major members, the specific character of 80-year-old white oak that has been doing structural work all its life and has developed in that doing a particular density and resonance that cannot be manufactured. She hired a structural salvage crew from Wichita who worked with historic timber frame buildings and understood what she was asking them to preserve. She walked them through the structure before they began identifying the members she needed intact: the main trusses, the ridge beams, the primary mortise and tenon assemblies, the hand-hewn column posts that ran from foundation to top plate, the wood that Walter's grandfather's hands had shaped, the wood that had held 80,000 bushels of grain through a Dureco and had absorbed the chemistry of 3 months of natural malting into its grain and its surface, the wood that still smelled weeks after the grain was gone of what had happened inside it. The rest of the structure came down in 6 days. Over the winter and into the following spring, Dorothy built the new facility on the cleared footprint. It was a modern building, climate-controlled, insulated, equipped with the floor malting beds and temperature management systems and monitoring technology that Walsh's agricultural consultants had specified and that the specialty grain market required. Its walls were structural steel and insulated panel, and its mechanical and electrical systems were the systems of a working commercial-scale specialty food production facility. But its structural frame, the visible interior columns, the heavy exposed roof beams, the long spans of the main ceiling was built from the salvaged white oak of the old barn. The original hand-hewn members had been remilled to dimension and reassembled by the same structural salvage crew into the bones of the new building, their surfaces still showing the adze marks of the men who shaped them in 1943, their material still carrying the accumulated history of everything that had happened inside and around them. Hank stood in the finished facility on the day the last installation was complete and looked up at the old oak beams in their new configuration. "It still smells like it," he said. He was right. The aged white oak retained the olfactory record of 3 months of natural floor malting in a way that no cleaning and no passage of time had been able to fully remove, a faint but unmistakable presence of that sweet toasted warmth that was now in the craft spirits industry's growing awareness of the Hargrove operation, the characteristic aromatic signature of the farm's work. Dorothy had come to think of it not as a remnant, but as a continuity. The old barn was not gone. It was inside the new building, doing different work in a different form, which was a description that applied to more than the timber. Dorothy signed the first formal specialty grain supply agreement with Walsh's distilling network in the following spring. Over the course of the first full operating year, the agreements expanded 8 craft distilleries across Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Montana, each working with heritage grain varieties that Dorothy had selected with help from agronomists at Kansas State University. Varieties that the commodity market had no use for, and that the craft spirits market was willing to pay significant premiums to access. She stopped growing commodity wheat entirely. She hired a process chemist from the university's food science department and a veteran grain handler from western Kansas who had spent 3 decades doing the work conventionally and was interested in doing it with intention and precision. The second year brought 12 supply agreements. Regional agricultural press began referring to Hargrove Farm as a notable address in the specialty grain landscape. The malting facility had not been built in isolation. It had been built in collaboration with Walsh's consultants, who specified the equipment with the Kansas State agronomist, who helped her select the heritage grain varieties with the structural salvage crew, who remilled the old oak and understood what she was asking them to do with it, with Hank, who had opinions about every aspect of the design and was right about most of them. She had expanded the workforce. The process chemist, a young woman named Caroline, who had come from a research background in food science and had an appetite for the specific intersection of agricultural practice and fermentation chemistry that the Hargrove operation represented, had turned out to be one of the better hires Dorothy had made in 4 decades of running a farm that employed people. Caroline approached the work with the combination of scientific rigor and genuine curiosity that made her both effective and interesting to have around, and she had an ability to translate the chemistry she was tracking into language that Dorothy could use in conversations with distillers and buyers, which was itself a substantial professional skill. The grain handler was a man named Earl, 60 years old, who had spent his career in the commodity grain system and who had come to the Hargrove operation with the specific freedom of a person who had done the conventional thing for long enough that doing it differently held genuine appeal rather than risk. Earl knew grain the way Dorothy knew grain, through the senses and the accumulated pattern recognition of decades, and he and Dorothy had developed in the first year the specific working shorthand of 2 people who see the same things when they look at the same material and do not need to explain their perceptions to each other. The farm had become something that Dorothy had not fully anticipated when she was sitting in the cooperative's parking lot in August, deciding whether to drive to the feedlot or drive back to the old barn. She had anticipated survival. She had hoped for stability. She had not imagined that the decision made in those 6 minutes would produce 3 years later a working farm with a commercial identity in an emerging market, with contracts in 4 states and a workforce of 4 people and a bottle of award-winning whiskey on the kitchen table. She had not imagined it, but she was also not surprised by it in the way you are surprised by something that has no precedent. She was surprised by it the way you are surprised by the specific form that something takes when the general direction of it was already somewhere in the territory of what you had considered possible. The possibility had been in the grain all along. It had been in the old barn's white oak and the August heat and the specific enzymatic character of wheat that had been confused by late rain into beginning to become something other than what it was planted to be. The possibility had been there. It had needed someone to refuse the easy dismissal of it to carry it through the 6 minutes in the parking lot and the weeks in the barn and the storm and the legal challenge and the long waiting period until the trucks came. Dorothy had been that person. She had not been that person because she was exceptional. She had been that person because the farm needed her to be, and because 41 years of running this land had given her the specific preparation for that particular version of the task. This, too, was a form of harvest, not the grain kind, the other kind, the kind where you discover in the moment of necessity that the life you have been living has been quietly equipping you for it. In late October of the 3rd year after the season of the rejected harvest, a wooden shipping crate arrived by secure courier. It was delivered to the farmhouse door, not the malting facility, and the return address on the label said simply Walsh Agricultural and Distilling Sciences, Denver, Colorado. Dorothy brought it to the kitchen. She did not open it immediately. She made coffee in the way she had been making coffee her whole life, measured, unhurried, attending to the process rather than treating it as something to be completed, and she carried 2 cups upstairs to the bedroom where Walter was sitting in the chair by the east window looking out over the October fields in the low morning light. The east window was the window that faced the malting facility. The building sat where the old barn had been on the same foundation footprint, and from the bedroom window at this time of year it was framed by the remaining cottonwood trees in the way the old barn had always been framed by them, and the sight of it from this specific angle was the sight of something familiar occurring in a new form. Dorothy set Walter's coffee on the side table and sat on the edge of the bed. The October light was doing what it always did at this hour, coming in low and long and precise, laying a clean gold line across the floor from the window to the far wall, illuminating the dust motes in the air above their decades-old bedroom furniture with the impartiality that good light applies equally to everything it finds. She told him there was a box in the kitchen, from Walsh. Walter said, "Let's open it," and the deliberateness of his speech gave the four words a weight and intention that was not quite the same as his pre-stroke voice, but carried in it a fullness she had come to recognize as its own kind of clarity. They went downstairs together. Walter moved with his cane and the specific careful rhythm of his post-stroke gait, a pace that was not slow so much as considered the pace of a man who had reconfigured his relationship with physical movement into a form that was deliberate rather than automatic, and who had found in that reconfiguration a quality of attention to each step that he had not previously had. Dorothy stayed close without staying too close, which was a distinction she had learned over the past 3 years and that she understood as one of the more important forms of care available to her, being present without removing his authority over his own movement. Hank was in the kitchen. He had appeared through the back door with the timing he had developed over 23 years of knowing which moments were the ones worth being present for. The box was pine, the lid secured with 2 wood screws. Dorothy opened it on the kitchen table with a flathead screwdriver. The interior was fitted with black foam. Resting in a precisely shaped cavity in the center was a bottle of heavy, wide-shouldered glass, the shape of the traditional spirits containers the craft movement had reclaimed as aesthetic reference, serious and substantial, and clearly made for the specific purpose of holding something whose value justified the weight. The liquid inside was a deep amber that shifted in the kitchen light, richer, darker, more complex in its color than the lighter spirits Dorothy had seen on other people's shelves, a color that had in it the character of time. The label was clean and typographically direct. Hargrove Estate, Barn Malt Reserve, single malt American whiskey, distilled and aged by High Plains Distilling Syndicate from naturally floor malted hard red winter wheat, Hargrove Farm, Pratt County, Kansas. And below that, in the same deliberate letter form, Double Gold Award, San Francisco World Spirits Competition. A card was tucked beneath the bottle's neck. Dorothy unfolded it. The handwriting was Walsh's, which she recognized from the letter of intent he had written on a September evening in a failing barn 3 years ago. It said, "They said it was ruined. We proved it was perfect. To the harvest, Dorothy." She set the card down on the table and stood there for a moment looking at it. Then she opened the bottle and poured 3 glasses. She handed the first to Hank, who took it with both hands and held it for a moment with the particular attention of a man who is looking at the material evidence of something he participated in from the beginning. He did not drink immediately. He looked at the color of it, and then he looked at Dorothy, and he nodded once, a small, complete, final nod. She carried the second glass to Walter and placed it in his hand, his large hand that closed around the glass with its remaining steadiness, and she watched him bring it to his nose, his eyes closed. Something moved across his face that was not easily named, not pain, not joy, precisely, but the deep, complex expression of a person recognizing something they know from a very deep level of association, something that activates memory and knowledge and feeling simultaneously rather than in sequence. He recognized the grain. He had smelled it for 40 years coming in off the fields at harvest, sitting in the cab of the combine at the end of a long day, standing at the end of a row with the August sun on his back and the smell of the crop around him. And something of that smell, transformed, concentrated, refined by distillation in time and oak, was still present in the glass, and Walter found it there with the absolute certainty of recognition. He opened his eyes and he looked at Dorothy. "That is ours," he said. Dorothy raised the third glass. Outside the kitchen window, the October morning was doing what it always did, being entirely itself, making no accommodation for the significance of what was happening inside the farmhouse, indifferent and vast, and in its indifference and vastness, making the farmhouse and the people in it and the work they had done feel both small and essential in the way that only a very large landscape can make things feel. The east fields ran out to the tree line in the morning light, the stubble from the current season's heritage grain harvest lying flat and gold brown in the low sun. The malting facility stood where the old barn had been, its old oak bones visible through the facility's windows when the interior lights were on. which they were not this early, so the building was simply a solid, purposeful shape in the morning, occupying the same ground that the old barn had occupied and carrying in its structure the memory of what the old barn had contained. The access road ran back through the property toward Route 281, where a woman had stopped a truck one winter night and chosen not to drive past, and where 47 motorcycles had come in out of a storm on a different night, and where a silver sedan had come and gone on a morning when the weather was finally done with being the worst thing in this particular story. Dorothy drank. The whiskey was warm immediately. It had a first wave that was exactly the grain she had lived with in the old barn, the toasted honey, the sweet, warm bread, the specific sweetness of sugars that had been made rather than simply being present. And then something else came after, slower, a deeper thing, something that had the character of oak and thyme and the particular mineral quality of the water that ran through the soil of Pratt County. Something that could only have come from the combination of this grain and this process and this place in this specific sequence of events. It tasted like the rain that came too late in the barn that was never supposed to hold grain, and the telephone call at 2 in the morning to a cell number found on an archived conference page from a year that had nothing to do with this year. It tasted like 47 motorcycles in an amber line on a dark access road after a storm, and the men who rode them doing 4 hours of barn work in the middle of the night because a woman they considered a neighbor had needed it done. It tasted like a letter of intent signed on the hood of a black Suburban in a September morning by a woman whose hands were shaking but whose signature was steady. It tasted like a bank draft placed on a branch president's desk on a Thursday in October, and the drive home afterward, and the phone call to Rosalind, and the words, "Get the room ready, the real room upstairs where it belongs." It tasted like the grain that was supposed to destroy them, transformed by everything that had been done to it and for it and with it into something that would last far longer than the crisis that created it. It tasted like Walter's hands on the glass and Hank's quiet nod, and the old white oak beams doing new work in their new form, still carrying in their grain the faint persistent smell of 3 months of something that should have been a disaster being made into something fine. It tasted like 4 generations of people who had refused to be finished by the things that tried to finish them, and the 5th generation that had found in that refusal not merely survival, but something finer than survival, the specific, unrepeatable, award-winning character that comes only from genuine difficulty, genuinely met by a person who understood that the difference between ruined and extraordinary was sometimes nothing more than one decision made alone at 2 in the morning. To stay with the grain instead of walking away from it. It tasted like the harvest. It tasted like everything the harvest was always supposed to become.